So welcome to our podcast, which is psychotherapy based. Very, very excited tonight because we have as guest Dr. Debbie Joffe Ellis. And she is a psychologist originally from Australia. She's adjunct professor at Columbia University in New York. She's affiliated with several important major associations. She's got a doctorate in alternative medicine, and she's received a gold medal in recognition of her service to the field of alternative and holistic medicine from the World Health Organization, no less. She currently has a private practice in New York City, and she also delivers lectures, workshops, and seminars throughout the USA and across the globe. And much of Dr. Joffe Ellis's work today is as a dedicated proponent of REBT, Rational Emotive Behaviour Therapy. As a result of her work with her late husband, psychologist Dr. Albert Ellis, he being the remarkable pioneer of cognitive behavioural therapy, and many call him the grandfather of CBT. He is an undoubted giant in the field of psychotherapy. And they worked together for several years, giving public presentations and professional trainings, as well as collaborating on writing and research projects until his sad death in 2007. And from my own personal perspective, I was lucky enough, and I'm old enough, to have gone to one of his Friday night practices in New York. And I can tell you, it was like seeing David Bowie. It was like going to a Prince concert. It was absolutely packed. There was no room for anyone, and I squeezed in at the back, and there were millions of people trying to speak to him, trying to listen to what he had to say. And he was well into his 90s by then, and you really don't get that kind of status in psychotherapy or psychology without a serious amount of amazing work. So, over to you.
Thank you, India. Thank you for that gracious introduction. It's such a pleasure to be with you, and I want to acknowledge you for the great work that you do. And well, my mission, my passion, what I love to do is to share with as many people as possible, whether they're academics, professionals in the healing field, teachers, social workers, people in the medical fields, and members of the general public. It brings me joy to share with them the life-enhancing approach of rational emotive behaviour therapy. For some people, that's a mouthful. Let's call it REBT from now on. But it's not only an evidence-based scientific approach, and I like to say imbued with compassion, but it's also a way of life for those people who choose to apply it as such. And so my late husband did entrust me to continue his work. Of course, not only me, people like you, India, people who embrace REBT and also have the desire, the privilege, the pleasure of contributing to other people, helping them to minimize misery and maximize joy in life. But I suppose I do have a unique position, given that he and I worked together so closely, doing practically everything together work-wise in his final decade of life. And, you know, the fact that I know the materials so well, the fact that I knew him so intimately on every level does give me a unique platform that I humbly accept and am honored to do my best on, imperfectly, as the fallible human that I am. But what I am confident to say is that I do my best to practice what I preach and what he preached. And I use my head, but I truly come from my heart, and not to sound too woo-woo when I say that. So, gosh, is that a long, brief introduction to me? In addition to what you said, I teach at Columbia and at other universities. I'm often invited to do workshops or trainings. I love to travel. Right now, I travel around the world from this position in my apartment, but when it's safe, I'll travel physically again. And to turn as many people on as possible who aren't already turned on, and those who are already turned on to fuel their fire of embracing and applying REBT.
Well, REBT for me was a game changer. It changed my life. And then obviously I've gone on to treat clients, and I use it with every single client. And I think I've treated thousands. I was trying to count them the other day, and we've all used REBT. So it's had a massive impact on people's lives. But one thing I was going to highlight was how groundbreaking it is, because I don't think people realize that we now are very much leaning towards what we call acceptance-based approaches. You know, we look at things like acceptance commitment therapy and mindfulness-based therapy. And I think that REBT was the first. I put REBT in that camp of acceptance-based therapy. And let's not forget that Albert Ellis was doing this way back. And if you could just tell us a little bit about that, because in fact, he was way ahead of his time.
He was, India, way ahead of his time. He was not only a visionary, an idealist, a pragmatist, but he was a visionary as well. You know, the things he came up with that now we have solid scientific evidence for, there was no such evidence for that. You know, just one small example is from the get-go. So he started, even though he trained in psychoanalysis, because he had no choice. So he practiced it under supervision in order to get his license after he graduated. And he found that many of the people he worked with felt better after a session, but he didn't feel that they were getting better, and that he really wanted people to empower themselves by taking responsibility for their own emotional well-being, by realizing that's not events or their mother and father or whoever that made them feel a certain way that might be emotionally unhealthy, but their perception of it, their thoughts about it. So, and so way back then, he was becoming more active directive and giving clients, or they were called patients in those days, homework activities to do, again, to be proactive. And he was asking them to do certain techniques for at least 30 days. Now, at that time, people might have thought, why 30 days? Why not 3? Why not 300? You know, and fast forward to a few decades ago, where research into the brain and neuroplasticity shows that it takes a minimum of 30 days to create pathways. So that's just one example of many supporting what you just said, India, that he was way ahead of his time. Across the board, I mean, he was pushing in the 1940s for equal rights for women, for equal rights for gays.
Yes.
So it wasn't just in psychotherapy, but in society. So back to acceptance, one of the core principles, one of the essentials of REB from the get-go, before third wave approaches, which include acceptance commitment theory, is the emphasis on the importance and benefit of developing greater unconditional self-acceptance, unconditional other acceptance, and unconditional life acceptance. From the 1940s, that has been a core principle. And yes, especially since my husband died, and with the great exposure and the great research, I'm not kind of wanting to sound like I'm in competition or in any way diminishing the excellence of Aaron Beck's, rest in peace, Dr. Beck.
Rest in peace, as of yesterday.
A few days ago, so not diminishing that, but it doesn't have to be either or, both and. And since my husband's passing, REBT has been marginalized, and many of the people who studied with him and were teaching, preaching REBT have moved to either a hybrid REBT-CBT or CBT, because insurance companies, at least in America, cover them, and in Australia, where I'm from. I don't know the situation in the UK, and because there is more research supporting it. However, because REBT is at the core of CBT, and the great late Dr. Aaron Beck used to acknowledge that, the research supporting CBT supports those areas in REBT. It's not surprising. Yeah, so way ahead of his time, being marginalized, and again, to come back to my passion, my mission is to bring REBT into greater prominence again, to be appreciated across the globe, across the board, by various areas, not just psychology. Not because I was married to him and it's the greatest, therefore, but because I loved and embraced it when I was a student in Australia. When, what? If you had told me one day I was going to be married to him, I would ask, what are you on? You know, who would have thought? Life's funny that way. So
we'll go on to this later and speak about it, but he pioneered behavior work. So I think long before that was evidence-based, he, as you said, was setting his patients behavioral homework to go and do. And that sits at the very core of CBT and is highly effective. In fact, in terms of therapeutic approach, ERP that has actually arisen from that is considered one of the most effective and research and evidence-based interventions, but that's part of the REBT model.
Yeah, well, but in addition to the behavioral homework that you rightly mentioned, there are also cognitive techniques and emotive techniques. You know, you got CBT. What's REBT got? E. Equal emphasis on the importance of understanding emotions, the difference between the healthy and the unhealthy ones, and the ways to create the healthy ones and minimize, with the goal of eliminating the tendency to create the unhealthy ones. When my husband was developing REBT, originally, by the way, it was called rational therapy, and then it became rational emotive therapy. REBT, to reflect how holistic it is. Al put in the B in 1993. So, you know, Pavlov started work on what was to become behaviorism, and then concurrent with my husband developing his approach was Joseph Wolpe, who was known as a contemporary behaviorist. But yeah, from the get-go, as you indicate, my husband included behavioral techniques and also emotive and cognitive, of course.
And I think that's developed through even on it by itself, without any promotion or marketing or anything like that. It's actually now known, REBT, to be very holistic and very quick.
Most definitely, for a significant population. A few exceptions to the brief therapy application are people with more serious conditions. For example, that's kind of a segue to the area that you have expertise in, and that's OCD, borderline personality disorder. These are complicated conditions. Now, REBT has been proven to be very effective, but in those instances, more sessions are required in most cases. For people suffering from anxiety and depression, so forth, fewer sessions may be required before solid success ongoingly is experienced. Of course, REBT reminds us that ongoing effort is needed for all of our lives, not only to create, but to maintain the benefits and the beneficial changes. But in terms of what you say, REBT is such a brilliant brief therapy for significant others, with the exceptions of people with more complex conditions.
Yes, And as you say, I kind of always use the metaphor with clients of REBT teaches you the exercise. It's like going to the gym. It teaches you the exercises that are highly effective and that will help you manage your life. But then you can't, to keep the muscle toned, you need to use it throughout your life and practice.
Even Albert Ellis was applying it to himself. Yeah. Right. At the end, when people had betrayed him,
yes,
he practiced unconditional other acceptance. In articles in the New York Times and other places, and we don't have time to go into it now, but there was some pretty brutal situations at the end of my husband's life within the institute bearing his name, and he was kicked off the board of which he'd been president, and he was stopped from working there. And in being interviewed by the media, he said, and he wasn't just saying words, I know this to be very authentically true. I hate what they're doing, he said. He hated their actions, but I don't hate them. And that is the master practicing what he preaches, unconditional other acceptance. REBT doesn't encourage us to just accept bad behavior. No way.
No.
But he encourages us to do what we can, to change what we can that's brutal, cruel, unjust, but from a healthy emotional place. Right. And REBT gives us the tools for achieving that.
It really does give you a set of skills. And that's actually quite different to, we're certainly changing our perceptions, but our perception of psychotherapy last century was very Woody Allen, wasn't it? You'd lie on the couch and there would be this, and of course it's a very visceral kind of memory and image, but it was very much that. And the characteristic of that was that at the very least, you'd be in therapy years. I think the average term was at that time was something like 5 to 10 years in therapy. Long time.
So that's the classic psychoanalytic Freudian approach. And, there are still a lot of therapists practicing it, believe it or not. But to be able to do that, a client or patient would need a lot of time and a lot of money. One of the main benefits can be some insights.
Yeah.
But in my experience, you can get them in a shorter period of time,
Right.
So
with
anyway,
less
money, less time, and self-empowerment, and not requiring a therapist. So, but different folks for different folks. And in psychoanalysis, that classic view of the therapist behind so that the client, the patient can free associate, not be distracted, and rapport isn't really required. It's not that much a necessity in psychoanalysis, but in REBT, it's also not a necessity.
Right.
But despite some myths that are not true, I guess that's why they're myths, that REBT says it's not important, a good therapeutic relationship, that's not true at all. REBT recognizes what research has proven, that a healthy rapport between therapist and client or patient actually can enhance the efficacy of the therapeutic process. So REBT certainly is for a healthy connection. What REBT discourages is a client or patient depending,
yeah,
the therapist to feel good, having an unhealthy dependence on, not owning their own power to create and maintain well-being.
And so we're in that age where we see kind of practitioners almost a bit more as a scientist in some ways. And certainly in the UK, we have something called the National Institute of Clinical Excellence. And what that means is it informs and guides all healthcare, medical and psychotherapy, and it sets guidelines for those approaches that are evidence-based. And it clearly mentions REBT. It mentions cognitive therapies, and then it talks about Aaron Beck's CBT, and it talks about Albert Ellis's REBT. I'd wonder if you could just give us a little snapshot on the differences between CBT and REBT. They are both evidence-based for anxiety and for OCD. I prefer REBT. That's my personal choice to treat OCD. But if you could give us just an idea of the differences, I think a lot of people are confused about that.
Yeah, great question. I'd love to do that. Well, the first thing that I'll mention that both Aaron Beck, or Al and I called him Tim. His friends called him Tim because his full name was Aaron Timken. So we would call him Tim. So in 2003 and 2005, 3 articles came out by Tim, by Beck and Ellis, and a cognitive psychologist, Dr. Christine Podesky, who I have tremendous respect for as well. So Beck, Ellis, Podesky. And they all agreed. So Podesky is cognitive, Beck and Podesky, and Ellis REBT. And they all agreed that REBT is the more philosophical, that REBT has the greater emphasis on encouraging a person to think about their philosophy of life and living their beliefs in that regard. Where they disagreed was that Beck and Podesky said that CBT is more scientific. And Ellis, Albert Ellis, and this Ellis, Debbie Joffe Ellis, vehemently disagree with that because, you know, the fact is, there's more CBT research. But as I said earlier, that supports REBT premises because CBT is based on REBT. It doesn't emphasize certain qualities, which I'm about to mention in answering your. In Al's autobiography, he includes some correspondence between Beck and Al, and how Al really contributed to, first it was called CT, cognitive therapy, then became CBT, and which came out in the late 1960s, REBT in the early 1950s. 53 was when the first article on REBT, then called RT, was published. Anyway, so REBT is more philosophical than CBT, but they're both equally scientific. REBT puts strong emphasis on the importance of unconditional self-acceptance, unconditional other acceptance, and unconditional life acceptance. Then REBT, in its practice, contains or encourages more precision during the disputing phase. Yes, in CBT, there's disputing and it's Socratic. REBT has Socratic disputing, pragmatic disputing, logical disputing. So there's more precision, many cognitive and other approaches, as does REBT, have a goal of replacing the distorted ideas, or REBT calls them irrational beliefs, with healthy ideas, rational beliefs. But REBT wants to root out every amount of toxin, every irrational belief, get to the source and uproot it. So not just, oh, I'm thinking that, let me replace it with this, but to dispute the life out of the irrational beliefs so that they have no more credibility, so that we don't believe them anymore. You know, we can replace them, but if we still sort of believe them, they'll keep cropping up. So more precision in the disputing. And the fact that REBT is so imbued with compassion, I'm not saying that CBT practitioners don't also embrace that, but in terms of a theory and approach and what we largely encourage and preach, those things are more vocally out there than it seems in CBT. Now, there's not only the third wave, ACT, DBT, but I am aware that recently there's a fourth wave, and I think it's called positive CBT, something like that. which to me sounds like a marriage of positive psychology and REBT equals positive CBT. I'm not sure. Martin Seligman, who I love and respect, who's known as the father of positive psychology, has acknowledged Al as being a huge influence in his work. Anyway, and the final thing I'll say here is regarding the myth that REBT is more confrontational than CBT. Don't agree with that. I mean, confrontation depends more on the manner of the therapist in a way. CBT wants to encourage a person to confront their distorted ideas, surely. But I think what they're talking about is the misconception that because Albert Ellis was very in your face and tough love, that's the way one should practice REBT. And no, not at all. REBT is vigorous and enthusiastic about confronting that which doesn't serve a person. But if someone comes in grief, REBT is not going to get in your face and say, now, what are you telling yourself? You know, it's so I want to say that REBT is not necessarily more confronting of a client or patient, but maybe more vigorous, appropriately so, in certain sessions in confronting irrational thinking.
And I think there's an energy about REBT, isn't there? There's a kind of energy that you just don't get with anything else. And I see clients, the light bulb goes off, and like, oh my God, yes, of course.
You know, one of the maladies of many people is the need for certainty.
Yeah.
And one of the countless gifts of REBT relating to what you just rightly said, India, is encouraging a person to accept the reality that there is no certainty. Now, we might say there's a high probability, but that's no guarantee. Another thing, when you were talking, it came to my mind. I want to share this with you, and it applies very much, by the way, to when one works with people with OCD. Some people are allergic to discomfort. It's got to be easy. Absolutely. Or they think it's too hard and I'll never be able to. And one of the things that REBT encourages people to do who are working on eliminating irrational thinking and unhealthy emotions is to welcome discomfort. As a tool, you know, as part of developing greater high frustration tolerance. In other words, I can stand what I don't like, I just don't like it. But to add to that, not only can I stand it, but I welcome it, because this can help me become more comfortable with what I'm uncomfortable with now, and therefore experience greater joy in life. So people with OCD, for example, who have rituals, encouraging a person not to avoid discomfort in certain ways, but to embrace it and see it as part of a valuable journey towards greater health and well-being.
It's a huge part of our protocol here, and I often think in life it's true that the most successful people are those that tolerate discomfort well, because it's easy to tolerate success and comfort, isn't it? It's very difficult to tolerate failure and discomfort. And you know, you've mentioned in the last years of Albert Ellis's life, you know, he had to deal with a fair amount of discomfort.
On many levels, physically. Yeah. I mean, he was aged, he had osteoporosis, he had some arthritis, he was a brittle diabetic, was dealing with balancing his blood sugar every few hours, you know, for decades. And you know, he was hard of hearing. That was one of the ways I could serve our work, that often, luckily or unluckily, my tone of voice, wherever it is, he could hear. when we worked together, either in workshops or with permission, sometimes I would be present when he did one-on-one therapy. I could repeat to him what the person said, and he would hear me. And so they're the physical challenges that he endured. But the most painful thing of his life was when he was 90, being stopped from working in his own institute and being kicked off the board that I mentioned earlier. You know, some of the people who did that, you know, they had their agenda. They obviously thought they were justified and right in what they were doing. Some of these people he had treated as if they were his own children, through their association with him and his institute, and also professionally he helped them rise. And it was very painful, but as I indicated, he practiced what he preached till the end. But you know, an emotionally healthy person, that doesn't preclude grief and sadness. Yeah, and it was the greatest sadness he ever experienced, the betrayal and some of the brutal actions that we had to endure.
Yeah.
But he practiced what he preached till the end, and he was such a role model for me, and I practiced and still do, and I'm so grateful. I'm so grateful because I'm very cognizant, you know, as my years roll along, of the finiteness of life and how many precious things are within it, despite and including the brutal things that can be in it at times. And using REBT really keeps my head well above water and gives me the strength to help people who are suffering a lot.
Dr. Ellis, in many ways, missed the YouTube social media environment we live in today. It wasn't the YouTube age. And I just wonder, for those who weren't lucky enough to be there or understand his kind of rock star status, if you could just give us a little flavor of the true legacy of Albert Ellis.
So Al was one of, if not the first. Now, Alfred Adler did this too, what I'm about to say, but in a huge way. Albert Ellis encouraged self-help and was very prominent in the media in his times. He very much promoted his approach in a way that people who weren't getting therapy could apply it. Many of the books he wrote, you didn't have to be an academic to understand them. They were very simple to understand and apply. He was also, I think, the first in his field to have the guts to do live sessions in front of an audience.
Yes.
Now, he insisted, and I do this too, I love doing live demonstrations. And I do what he did, which is saying, don't want to do a role play. Is there anyone courageous enough to bring up a real issue you're going through now so that we can demonstrate the application of REBT? So to come back to the Friday night workshops, they were known around the world, really. And as you said, standing room only. Sometimes there'd be a line of people all down the street waiting. And so what he did was invite two people, you know, one at a time, to bring up a real issue. And he would demonstrate it. And then make 15 minutes available for the people in the audience to ask questions or make comments. So it was this opportunity for people not only to witness, but often to relate in order that they could apply principles to their own lives. What a service. He started in the 1960s, and after he was kicked out of the institute or stopped from working there, we didn't stop. We rented a room in the building next door, and it was still standing room only. So he wanted to make his approach accessible to as many people as possible. He was witty. He was often very funny. He often used colourful language. You know, he wasn't for everyone. People who were easily offended were turned off, so they didn't come. And not wanting to sensationalize for the sake of sensationalism, no. Wanting to kind of shake them from any rigid thinking tendencies in order to welcome some new thinking, new rational thinking. And so they were great. He would start each one with, I can't imitate him, a few people, mainly men with masculine voices, are pretty good at it, but it was something like, "Oh, this is Albert Ellis. Welcome to my famous Friday night workshop that I've been giving every Friday night for the last 40-something years, where people cure their problems one person at a time. Takes a long time, but at least you get lousy coffee and free cookies." And, you know, in the beginning decades, it would be $1 and then $2. In the final decade of his life, because the management insisted, it was $5. So wanting to make it accessible with the goal of, in this one life we have, and for people who believe in many lives, even those beliefs agree that this body has finite time. So in the one life, that we cherish what's good, that we not create misery unnecessarily, that we understand that some of the healthy emotions are painful, but they're enriching and they're healthy. And to teach us the difference between healthy and unhealthy thinking, to empower ourselves to just have better lives, and in so doing, to help other people, to be models of hope and example for other people. It's not just about me, let me be happier. There's that. In so doing, let me help other people to create their own happier, better, enriched lives.
It was amazing. And how old was he at his last Friday night workshop? How old was he?
I think he was 91. He was 91 and he died 18 months later, I believe, and his doctors agreed with me that if not for the stress of continuing his work as an outsider of his institute, fighting for justice, the physical issues that he held, but if not for that, he probably would have lived more years. I mean, I believe he would have lived to be past 100.
Yeah.
But, you know, this is pure speculation. The main thing is, yeah, he died at 93, but oh, what treasures he gave humanity, and many people are using those treasures to give added treasures to humanity, and what a force for good.
And what I'd love to do is to now bring this to a younger generation, you know, to say this is an incredible, viable proposition to actually improve your life. And for my clients with OCD, I've seen the results.
Yeah, it's indisputable. One of my husband's greatest wishes, and I share it, is that REBT principles be taught in schools.
Yeah.
I mean, there are some schools, like in Australia, that do so. It's called Rational Emotive Behaviour Education. And way back in the 70s, my husband had the Living School within his institute that taught children. And my husband and Dr. William Naus, KNAUS, developed Rational Emotive Behaviour Education way back then. So Al's wish and my wish is that REBT is also taught in schools, in courses, just accessible.
Thank you so much again, and hopefully we can do another one in the future.
Yes. Thank you, Indy, again for your gracious hosting, for the work you do, and for being a shining light for REBT, and for encouraging and helping the people you help. And yeah, thank you for including me in this podcast, and I hope that it's going to inspire people to apply it to themselves and to help other people.